Well, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Well, Heavenly Father, again, we're so thankful that we have this opportunity to come together, to study, and to see what you have for us. I pray, Lord, you'll anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have said, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, last week, of course, we looked at Gideon's victory over the Midianites, kind of a misnomer. It was God's victory over the Midianites. And you remember at the last of that as the Midianite army was running and fleeing, they split into at least two major groups. One group stayed on the east side of Jordan, and the other one went on the west side of Jordan. And once they stayed on the west side of Jordan, they came down the valley and they got into the marshlands down there, and Gideon called for Ephraim to come and finish them off. And the other half cut across above the river Jabbok. On your maps you can see where that is. The map that has the arrows on it, you can see where how they cut off and actually split off. So what happened last week was Ephraim, well, it didn't happen last week, we studied it last week, that Ephraim caught up with the army that stayed on the west side and actually killed them all and took the two princes. And then Gideon pursued the rest of them across the Jordan River onto the east side and chased them down. So we're going to pick that up tonight in Judges chapter 8, beginning with verse 3. Now the men of Ephraim said to him, this talking to Gideon, "Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?" And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And now what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. All right, now, I know this makes a whole lot of sense, right? So let me give you a little background. Ephraim was the chief tribe of Israel at this time, mainly because of its size and its strength. It was also full of pride and conceit. In chapter 12, they were again passed over for battle, and their anger is kindled against Jephthah, another one of the judges. They get mad if you don't include them because they're so powerful, they're so great, they should be involved in every battle, you know. And if they're not involved, they get their pride hurt. Especially in this case, where we're going to find there was 135,000 Midianites that were killed, and they weren't called to come into battle. Now, Manasseh, I'll give you some history. Manasseh and Ephraim were the sons of Joseph. And so Joseph, or rather when Jacob was an old man, and he was getting close to the time to die, Joseph brought his two sons into Jacob and wanted Jacob to bless them. And you may remember the story. He took Manasseh, who was the oldest, and put him on Jacob's right hand, and he took Manasseh, who was the younger, and put him on the left hand. Or, I'm sorry, vice versa. Manasseh was the oldest, and he put him on the right side. Manasseh, the younger, and put him on this side. Well, when Jacob got ready to bless them, he put his arms and put his right hand on Manasseh, or on Ephraim, and his left hand on Manasseh. What this signified, you remember Joseph said, "Wait a minute, you're making a mistake. You got them hurt." And he says, "I know." They're both going to be great nations. They're both going to be great tribes, but Ephraim is going to be the greater. Manasseh will be the lesser. And so this, of course, fostered a great bit of ill will among the tribes. But Ephraim really became puffed up and full of pride. They are the chief. They received the greater blessing, therefore they are the most important tribe. And so what happened here was that Gideon, if you remember, did not call Ephraim to join in the army. Why did he not call them? It makes sense, wouldn't it? Logically, if you're going to go, you're already going to have only 20,000 men to go against 135,000. You'd think you'd want the best soldiers. You think you'd want the biggest tribe to send the, But the whole thing boiled down to is God didn't say call them. God told Gideon who to call to join the battle. He did not call Ephraim. And I think this is a lesson for us, even though, you have people who are very talented, people who are seemingly the, the leaders of the church, whatever. That doesn't mean they're called to do everything. God doesn't need anybody. That's the first thing we have to realize. Nobody is so big that God has to use them. And Ephraim, with all of its pride, with all of its strength, with everything that it had, God said, I don't need you. For the mission that we're doing, I don't need you. And I can see where, if you'd have had Ephraim, you'd have just had maybe you'd have had another 20,000 soldiers that you would have had to taken through the pond and had them go through it would have just wasted time. God didn't need them. He only needed 300. He didn't need all the strength of Ephraim. And of course, how are you going to tell Ephraim that? Gideon could have said, well, hey, sorry guys, but God didn't tell me to call you. You know how that would have went over? Really well. They would have just probably cut his head off. But Gideon had a very, he was very tactful in this. He showed a great deal of wisdom, because what he said to them is that, look, God has given you these leaders. I mean, look, you got Orab and Zeb. These are the princes. You can take these guys and you can march them through your cities, and you can say, look, we have the victory. These two princes who I'm sure were hated throughout Israel. Well, look, we got them. We captured them. And so what Gideon said here is that in comparison to what you've done, I have done nothing. And really, that was a true statement. What did he do? He stood by with his 300 men, with a horn in one hand and a torch with a broken pitcher in the other, and watched God defeat the enemy. They didn't do anything. They just stood there, watched him. Where Ephraim had to do battle. So his words were actually true. We didn't do anything. Look at everything you've done, and you've got two princes that you can, that's your trophies, and you get all of their goods. You get to have all of the spoils of this part of the army that came this way, and you get all of these goodies. What do we get? We don't get nothing. See? So what he did by saying that was he made Ephraim look at things a different way. Ephraim, right. Hey, yeah, they may have been down there in the valley fighting, but look, we get all the spoils. We get to march the princes around. And they got their pride, pumped up a little more, and, oh yeah, hey, this works out all right for us. And so they stopped being angry, and they just went on home. God didn't need them anyway. It was just advantageous that they shut off that southern route so that the army couldn't go on through. So that was I think shows that a man of God, a person of God, they have to have they need to have that ability to soothe others rather than just coming up against them and saying, hey, that's the way it is, live with it. Me, that my way, I'd approached them, I'd have said, it's really too bad, but that's just the way it is. Live with it, I've got God on my side, by the way, so if you want to try something, come on. That wouldn't work, you know. So that was this part of Gideon. All right, the second section of this is the rejection of Sukkoth and Penuel. Now, so we have Ephraim taking care of the part of the army that went straight down on the east bank, on the west bank. And so now we have Gideon, and he's pursuing this army. There's two kings involved, and we find later that they had about 10,000 soldiers with them. So these were the remnants of the battle that got out of the battle and escaped. And so they're headed for home. They've crossed the river and they're headed out into the desert. And here, hot on their heels, is Gideon and his 300. Now there's a couple of things to notice. Number one, 10,000 versus 300. You know, that's still not very good odds. You know. Secondly, Israel didn't have camels, didn't have all of the animals of war or things of war that the Midianites had. They were riding camels. Remember, the Bible said the valley had so many camels you couldn't count them. So probably their army was mostly on camelback, so they're going to make a lot faster time. They're not exhausted or tired. The camels are doing all the work. And so they're taking off and headed for home. And here's the 300 coming along behind them, run along, trying to keep up. So you kind of get the picture here of what was going on. So let's read Judges 8, beginning with verse 4. Then Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him, crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. Then they said to the men of Sukkoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me." That's Gideon said. "For they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian." And the leaders of Sukkoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" That's probably about the way they said it. So Gideon said, "For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then will I tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Then he went from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, "When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower." All right. So here we have Gideon's men are exhausted. They're tired. They've been running, chasing these guys. They're hungry. It's been a long day. And they come to this town. And, this had to have been, to them, a great sight. Here they are out in the middle of them. They're in the mountainous area. And they come around, and here's this town of Sukkoth. Now, Sukkoth means booths. And it was the place where Jacob built a house and erected booths, or stalls, for his animals. So he lived there for some time, and it was known as an area for raising livestock. It was located about 4 miles east of the Jordan and about a mile north of the Jabbok River. That's marked on your map there. And it belonged to the tribe of Gad. Now, the response of the leaders of the city of Sukkoth was the fact that the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, still had an army of 15,000. I said 10. It was actually 15,000 men, and Gideon only had 300. Sukkoth was also close to the territory of the Midianites. And so they also feared the sheiks that were in that area, because they were leaders, they were like tribal leaders, and they had their armies, and they were constantly raiding. And so you can understand from the point of view of Sukkoth, if they had helped David, or helped Gideon and his army, and they go to battle and they lose, what's going to happen to them? Is it worth the odds? Is it worth the chance? 15,000 against 300. Sorry, we're not taking that kind of chance. No way. We're not going to do that. So when you look at it from a logical standpoint, what they were doing made perfect sense. So Gideon's response to this, now, this, we look at this and it's barbaric. It really is. What he said was, when I get back, in peace, after I've destroyed the enemy. Notice there was no hesitation on the part of Gideon.
Yeah.
There was no, well, maybe, if I come back in victory. It was when. There was a positive that says, I am going to win the battle. Pastor yesterday kind of alluded to this when he said we need to start making statements and putting ourselves where we need to be. We too often use if.
Yeah.
We need to take if out of our spiritual vocabulary. Jesus said, these signs shall follow them that believe. If they lay the hands, and if, is there any ifs in there? He didn't say if you lay hands on them, and if it's my will, they'll be healed. Or if you're in the right place at the right time, you may speak with tongues. What did he say? They will. We need to get a hold of that and understand this is ours. It's our inheritance. When you go in and sit down, family member passes away, and you go in and sit down with the lawyer, they don't open the will and say, well, you're in the will, so if everything works out right, you'll get the money, whatever you're.
Yeah.
No, you're in the will, it's yours, here you go. And that has been given to us in the New Testament. What is a testament? Testament is a will. It's the will of Jesus Christ. It's given to us. It's our testament. It's our will. He said, greater things will you do than I've done. Wait a minute. Now, wait a minute. Now, that can't happen, because if we did greater things than he did, then we would be greater than him. That's our logic, right? We don't want to take any credit. We don't want to say, I don't want to say, be healed, because that would sound like I'm doing the healing. You see? But that's not the way God works. He said, whatsoever you do it how? In the name of Jesus. What does that mean? You do it in the power and the authority of Jesus. If you step out there with the power and authority of Jesus and say, be healed, it's not me, Dr. Steve, saying be healed. It's me using the power and authority that God has given me to say, be healed. We get this idea that we have to back away from being positive in what we do because, we don't really have, yes we do. He didn't say lay hands and pray. He said lay hands on them and they will be healed. It's that simple. And Gideon caught that. He understood that. God had said, I'm going to give them to you, wipe them out. Okay, we're wiping them out. That's it. There was no if or but. Only 15,000? Hey, that's nothing. We got 300, man. We're in good shape. That was his approach. I think if he was alone, he would have walked out there and said, when I come back in victory, because that's the kind of faith he had. That's the kind of believing that he had. So what did he do? He told these men this. This sounds terrible, but captives were often killed. Captives, that means the enemy, were often killed in those days by having them lay on a bed of thorns and briars. Now in the wilderness, they have over there, they have very big thorns and briars. You remember Jesus had a crown made of thorns, and they were big thorns like this. So you can imagine making a big bed of thorns and briars and stripping somebody down, making them lay on that. Then they covered them with briars and thorns, and they took a sled, which was a farm implement that they used to haul rocks, I think just a big wooden sled, big heavy sled, and they would pull that over them. Drive those thorns and pull them through their flesh so that it just ripped their flesh right off of them. Gruesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But Gideon said, when I come back, I'm going to take you out in the wilderness. I'm going to lay you on a bed of thorns. I'm going to cover you with thorns, and I'm going to take that big sledge or farm implements or whatever we have here, and we're going to drag that right over you and pull you through those thorns and pull those things right down into your flesh until you are dead. Terrible way of doing things. So Gideon just got up and went on his way. And it wasn't too much further than to Penuel, probably another mile maybe. Penuel was on the other side of the Jabbok River. Now Penuel was an interesting place because I don't know exactly where it was. They haven't excavated that particular area and found it yet. But from all of the history and things that they can piece together, evidently it was a place that was on the south side of the Jabbok River, and it overlooked the river, and it had a tower. And this tower was a defensive, a military tower that was a stronghold. And so what the town depended on was that tower, because they had watchmen up there, and if somebody came to invade their town, which was walled, they had this big tower, and they could get up there and shoot arrows, and no doubt the back of it was up against a mountain or a cliff or something so that they were protected. But the big thing about this town was this tower, and this was their protection. This was the sign that they were invulnerable. And so Gideon went to Penuel. And Penuel, by the way, means face of God. It's the place where Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord. It was at Penuel. They later built a city there. And this is what Jacob, or Gideon, was going to. It's just a short distance south of Sukkoth. So when Gideon went there and said, hey, we're starving, we need some bread, they got the same response as they got from Sukkoth. So what did Gideon tell them? Well, he didn't threaten them with taking them out in the wilderness and dragging them over with thorns. He just said, well, when I come back in peace, in other words, when I have defeated the enemy, I'm going to tear down your tower. You think, oh, well, what is that going to tear down the tower? Boy, that's really something. They'll just rebuild it. Well, we'll see why. They're not going to rebuild it when he gets to that part. And so then he went on his way. All right, starting with verse 10. Now we come to the Midianites' final battle. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Kargor, and their armies with them, about 15,000. All who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Now I want you to notice something here. These were 120,000 soldiers. How many other people do you think were with them? These were nomads. They had their wives, their kids, they had their whole towns, if you were, in tents. And they had all moved into this valley. So could we say there was 3 times that amount? Where were they? They were also killed in the battle. I had somebody asking me about Sodom and Gomorrah yesterday, the children, the women and children who they killed in Sodom and Gomorrah. God doesn't look at things the way we do. If the Midianites wanted their children to be safe, they should have stayed where they were. Once you step into God's territory, once you're in there violating what God has said, it's fair game. Now that doesn't seem right to us. We look at it and say, well, that's not right. Not right by who? We can't look at what God does by our own ideas. And that's what happens today. We have so many that want to discredit the Bible. They want to say, well, God is a God of love and God would never do this. He does it because He is a God of love. We don't understand all the inner workings in the spiritual world or even in the physical world. And so how can we possibly question why God does something? We have to just take it at face value and say, God has His reasons and it's not up for us to know about them. He'll let us know one of these days. We'll be able to cross Jordan and sit up there and say, now wait a minute, can I have time in about, 4,322 days? Do you have or years or whatever, do you have time for me to sit down? I want to ask you some questions. I have questions, as you know. I wouldn't spend time with a rabbi just because I had some offbeat questions that nobody else knew, so I had to find out. I got a lot of questions, so I hope he's got a lot of time because he's going to need it. If I can remember them, I got to figure out a way to write it all down. So I'll have it. Anyway, so much for that. So anyway, here was this army. That was all that was left, 15,000. Verse 11. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. Now it says it was in this place called Kargor, and there's a whole lot of speculation about what this was. But it seems like, from the structure of the words Kargor, and from other scriptures that we have concerning this particular area, specifically Numbers 31 and 32. Now it refers to part of the booty that Moses took from the Midianites, included 5,000 sheep. I want you to think about that, 5,000 sheep. Now, if you know anything about sheep, it takes a lot of territory to keep a sheep alive. They're not, you don't go out there, they didn't have things like we have today. They couldn't drive a truck out there and dump hay and whatever for the sheep, or food for the sheep. So they had to have very large areas for these sheep in order to keep them. So the word kukor seems to signify a wall or enclosed place, and may have been a very large sheepfold. And there are several references in secular writing that would refer to this same root word as meaning a sheepfold. So it's very possible that the Midianites crossed back over Jordan and came to one of these huge sheepfolds. They would have been walled up, probably 6 or 7, maybe 8 feet high, with rock walls to keep animals out. They could let their sheep in there, and there would be plenty of room for 5,000 sheep. Well, 15,000 soldiers don't need as much room as 5,000 sheep. So it seems very probable that what they did is they went into this sheepfold. And if you kind of picture in your mind, the sheepfold is probably sitting east-west, laid out with a single gate, probably fitting east. Or it may have been, we don't know. But I'm assuming maybe east. And And so what they did is the army went in there, and two things. Probably because they were on camels, because they traveled it with a certain amount of ease, they probably felt that Gideon's army had given up. You know, 300 guys on foot trying to chase 15,000 soldiers on camels. That's, you know, and they've already crossed over, and now they're in the wilderness. They're in the desert area close to where the Midianites, their territory. So they're right there, within a mile or two of their own territory. You know, this army is not going to pursue us any longer. So there was a certain amount of ease. Also, they probably figured that the army would be coming from the west, and so they set their sentries up. You know, everything was set up to watch for that army just in case they were going to show up. But notice what it says here. It says that Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents in the east of Nobah and Jethbahah. That was the eastern caravan route. So if you look at your maps, you'll notice that Kargar, I can't even say it, Kargar, that round circle at the bottom, that purple line there, okay, this is where the enemy went. They went this way, down into Kargar and found this sheepfold. But notice what Gideon did. He went the eastern route, long way around. He was tired. He was exhausted. It would have been easy to take the short route, but he took the long route. And he actually talks about an incline. So he went up into the hills on the east side and came around where the enemy would not expect him to come from. So while they were at ease in their shelter and they thought they'd made it, they were, you know, rest up a little bit, then make the final push home, here comes Gideon around the east side. Verse 12, when Zebah and Zalmunna fled. Now notice, it doesn't even say they went to battle. He just said, well, yeah, it does. Verse 11 says, went up by the road to dwell in tents on the east side of Nebo and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure when Zebah and Zalmunna fled. we don't even, they don't even take time to say what happened. Just these two took off. Gideon pursued them, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Now, I don't know about you. You know me and my crazy ideas. But I can kind of see Gideon's 300 guys. Maybe they jumped up on that wall and kind of surrounded him, you know, and then all of a sudden lit their torches and blew their trumpets and stood there. I don't know. I can just see them standing on the wall with their trumpets and their torches, and the enemy defeating, and they're running up. There they are again! Oh, no. You know, I don't know. But I could see that in my mind. Gideon said, hey, it worked once, God, let's do it again. That was fun. But they routed the army, they defeated them, and they took these two captive. All right. So now what happens? Well, Gideon has successfully defeated an army of 135,000 plus all the other people that were with them that had been harassing Israel for 7 years. Verses 13 to 17. Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from battle from the ascent of Heres. Now King James Version says from the rising of the sun. Now the reason for that is because the word Heres can mean sun, or it can have just a name, like a name. So the King James Version says from the rising of the sun. Current thought is that that would not be correct because the word that was used there was very rarely used to mean the sun. There was another word that would have been used. Rather, what it probably meant was a hill that was in that part of the territory. that had an ascent to it. That's why they came from the ascent of Heres. It was a sloped area probably, and you know they have huge mountains over there, you know. You look out there and you see this little, oh, that's Mount something so-and-so, and it's about 200 feet high, but that's a mountain to them, you know. So it could have been one of those situations where they had this area, perhaps a mountain. That word is Karish. Karish. It's rarely translated son, so it's generally believed to mean a location, perhaps a hill along the caravan route. And that would make more sense, I think, with what the context of this is, because he came back from the way, in other words, he came back the way he went. Came on back down. Verse 14. He caught a young man of the men of Sukkoth and interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Sukkoth and its elders, 77 men. So here he is, he's headed back, he's got his army, he's got a whole string of camels that are loaded down with all the booty, all of the spoils that they gathered up. And him and his 300 men are coming along, and they run into this young man. And so they captured him. Now, Sukkoth was a city of Israel. Normally, you wouldn't capture somebody from one of the cities in your own nation. But he did. They caught him or captured him. This automatically, to me anyway, indicates something, and that is that because of the actions of Sukkoth, they were no longer considered in the same structure or same group as the rest of Israel. Their actions had caused them to be banned, at least in the eyes of Gideon, who was the judge of Israel at this time, to be banned from the fellowship of Israel. And so he caught the young man. He captured him. And they interrogated him. I like that. You know, I can get the rubber hose out. Come on, tell me what I want to know. But they interrogated him, and he wrote down for them the names of all the leaders of Sukkoth. 77 leaders. Sukkoth, like other cities, was probably governed by a council of 70 elders. And this is, you'll remember we talked about Jerusalem when we were talking in the Gospels. The Sanhedrin was a council of 70 members. So what towns did is they emulated that. They had their own little Sanhedrin, if you will, which was usually made up of priests and civic leaders and others. And they interpreted law. They were the judges, the legal system, if you will, as well as the city council. They performed all those duties. But most cities had 70 men, if they were any size at all. They had 70 men. So in this case, they had their 70-man council plus 7. So these 7 were probably civil leaders. It might be like the mayor or somebody that would not be sitting on this council. So when Gideon came back to Sukkoth, verse 15, then he came to the men of Sukkoth and said, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men?" You see, when you act smart alecky to people, especially when God is concerned, sometimes you have to eat a lot of crow. In this case, it's a lot worse than that. You see, the actions of the leaders amounted to a public crime. Public crime. An act of inhumanity as well as a violation of the law. As such, they deserve the most severe punishment. You see, there was a law in those days that if someone came to you who was hungry, a stranger, or came to you hungry, you were expected to feed them. And you'll remember in our studies of the history of Israel, you remember the reason that Israel was dispersed and is no more, the nation of Israel as such, being the 10 tribes. What did God cite for the reason? We like to look at the idolatry. Oh, they were idolatrous. Oh, they turned from God. Oh, they set up a false temple. Oh, they had idols. They had all this stuff. But the reason God gave was not that. He said, because they did not feed and take care of the strangers, the widows, the fatherless, and because they took advantage of the poor. That was it. I mean, you can look that book over any way you want to, and you boil all of it off. Yeah, God was not pleased with their idolatry. No, He hated that. And it brought judgment on them too. But the final thing that caused the dispersion and the complete elimination of that nation was because of how they treated the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, and so on. So God puts this first. And that's a warning to us, because God is no different today than He was then. We're expected to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. Now, I want to be kind of clear about one thing. He didn't say you had to take care of those who willingly were put in those positions. Okay? And we have homeless today. I find that, I kind of laugh, and I got to get off on this a little bit, but I kind of laugh. I noticed in the paper, they're forming this commission to find out why people are homeless. And, I understand there are people who are homeless, and for no reason. I had a granddaughter who was out on the streets. It was not because of drugs or anything else. It was bad choices earlier, and couldn't find a place to rent, too expensive. I understand that. And so those are people who are poor, those are people who need help. But they were interviewing one person who lives on the street, had been on the street for years, and she said, I was watching it on a documentary. She said, you look around here, all us homely folks, and 90% of us are all drug addicts. Now that wasn't some, right-wing guy beating a drum. This was a person who lives on the street, been there for years. She says 90% of us are addicts. What does that tell you? They're there by their own choice, right, by their own poor decision making. And God does not tell us that we're supposed to support their poor decisions. So that's my 2 bits on the soapbox. Just in case somebody wondered about that. It's surprising how many people say, well, you should take care of those people. You should. The church needs to get out there and help these homeless folks. You send me somebody who's homeless not by their own choice or by their own poor decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'll do whatever I can to help them. Mm-hmm. I had one here Sunday that, I'm homeless, I live on the streets, and, I've been through rehab a couple times, and, I'm trying to get, I'm sorry. Go talk to the county, they have resources. I don't.
Yeah.
You sometimes have to draw the line, and that's not easy sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But there are those times when you just have to do that. All right. So these were grievous actions that these leaders had done. They violated the law, humanity, the law itself, and it was a public crime to do what they did. So Gideon took the leaders in verse 15. I'm sorry, on verse 16. And he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkoth. I like the way the Bible puts that. First time I read that, I thought he taught them. He must not have killed them, he must have just really beat them up good and let them go. But after I looked at it again, it doesn't say he taught the leaders. What he taught was the next generation of leaders, the men of the town. You see, when you violate God's law, this is what happens to you. Graphic picture of what happens when you violate the law of God. You think any of those guys were ever going to do that to anybody else? I mean, you see your leaders out there being torn to pieces with these briars and brambles and being dragged across the desert, and that must have been a terrible sight. And the next time something like this comes up and they decide they don't want to support anybody from Israel, or they don't want to take care of the stranger, or they don't want to take care of the poor, what do you think is going to pass through their minds? A very graphic picture. So Gideon taught the men of Sukkoth. Then, notice this, verse 17. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel. And then what did he do? And he killed the men of the city. Now some commentators, they say, well, probably he killed the leaders. That may be. That may be. But when we look at Penuel, we see a city who was so confident of their own strength. They had a tower. Hey, we have a tower. We got men. These must have been military men, It wouldn't be good to have a tower if you didn't have men who could fight, and defend the city. And so what Gideon did was he completely took down their defenses. He in effect said to them, because you think you're so strong, because you have put your trust in your tower and in your men, we're going to take them all out. And you are going to learn the hard way to put your trust in God. You didn't put your trust in me and my 300. You didn't put your trust, now get this, you didn't put your trust in me and my 300 that had just finished destroying 120,000 soldiers. Notice, it didn't say Gideon what was left of his 300. It said Gideon and his 300. Not one soldier was defeated or killed in that, chasing them up here, and probably there were skirmishes along the way, but none of them died. You see, Penuel should have put their trust in Gideon. Come on in, we'll feed you all the bread and stuff you want, we'll feed you, we'll take care of you, and we'll trust you to take care of us.
Yeah.
And yet God is the great victor. Look at how many battles he has won over the centuries. How many miracles, how many healings. How many times has he supported people? How many times has he blessed people? How many times has he paid bills? How many times has he given people when there was nothing to get? He managed, he gave it to them. How many times has this happened? And yet we don't put our trust in. We want to put it in our own tower that we have built, and we want to trust our own abilities. Now I'm a firm believer in education. I mean, nobody can ever say I don't push education. I've gone as far as I can go in education. I teach education. I teach classes. I try to get people to move up and get as educated as they can be. I love education. But if you try to put all of your eggs in the basket of education, you're going to fail. It doesn't work. God gives you skills. God gives you things. And you have to look at that from the perspective, God given me this, and I'm going to use it however He wants me to use it. But I'm not going to depend on that. Sometimes it's easy, like in my case, sometimes bills get a little tight, finances can get a little tight sometimes. And my immediate thing is, I wonder if, I can probably go out and teach at another university. I can add another university. I can teach in more than one. I can teach in a dozen if I want to. Man, I could just bring in another and just take on some more classes at some other university. I can go out and just do some consulting work. I can go out and do small business consulting or, something like that, a little consulting business. And I'm like, $200 an hour when you do that. So hey, I can go out and take a little job on, make some money, and I don't have to worry about anything. But that's not the way God wants it. If He wanted me to do that, I'd be happy to do it. But every time I've looked at it and I've started thinking about it, there's just this thing comes up and says, no, you don't want to do that. You just stay where you are. I'll take care of you. And you know what? He takes care of us.
Yeah.
Crazy things happen sometimes. But it just always works.
Yeah.
But you have to put your trust in God. No matter how skilled you are, your trust has to be in God. Now this tower he tore down, by the way, must have been made out of stone. It says he tore down the tower. And the King James Version said they beat it down. So they probably got out there with sledgehammers. You can see these 300 soldiers, tired as they were, with sledgehammers beating away on this tower until they had destroyed it. All right. We're going to be done short time tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. All right. Now, Gideon judges Zebah and Zalmunna. This is Judges chapter 8. It's just 7, it's 8. We're still in chapter 8. Verses 23 to 25. And he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? So they answered, as you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Now the immediate thing comes to mind is, what in the world were they talking about? I have researched this and nobody has any account of what this is referring to. So it was an unrecorded event that had taken place in the vicinity of Mount Tabor. So what he is asking here is not really in the original. It can also be looked at, instead of saying who you kill, it can also mean what happened to these men. Well, he knew they had killed them. But the question wasn't who were they that you killed, well, what had happened to them? Now it's very possible that some of Gideon's brothers fled to a fortified city at the base of Mount Tabor and were killed by the invading Midianites. There was a city, a town, at the base of Mount Tabor, and I haven't found the name of it, but they have uncovered, I guess, most of it. It was a walled city, a fortified city, and it's very possible that when the invading Midianites came in, some of Gideon's brothers actually ran into this city to hide or to seek refuge as these Midians came in. They evidently raided the city and killed these brothers of Gideon. Notice what Gideon says. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord.
Where are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong pew here.
You
Sorry.
are.
Verse 19. Okay, we're over here on the right side of the page now where I belong. I moved the paper, and that was the end of that. You see, I get lost easy. All right, they said each one resembled the son of a king. Then he, that's Gideon, then he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. Now this makes a very, very interesting statement here. Their response to what these men, or what happened to these men, what kind of men were they? They said they resembled the son of a king. They must have understood that there was something special about these guys. And so this was no doubt a opportunity to try to appease Gideon. Oh, they looked like the son of a king. In other words, they were beautiful, they were handsome, they had the bearing of royalty. They had everything about them, the attitude that everybody should desire to have. So it was kind of a compliment. It was a compliment to these men, but it was probably offered in the hope that it would appease the anger of Gideon. They no doubt had no idea who these men were. But Gideon says, they were my brothers. Now, we know in the scripture, my brothers. Well, that could be cousins, that could be, 4 generations out, they're my brothers. Thousands of brothers, depending on how you looked at it. But Gideon narrows it down to his natural brothers. Because he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. If he had said, the sons of my father, oh, that could be anybody. But not the mother. The sons of the mother were the exact sons of the mother. So these were his brothers. Natural brothers. That kind of explains, perhaps, why Gideon was willing to march across the Jordan River out into the desert to chase down these 2 kings. Now, I'm sure God had instructed him to, but there was also a personal reason. They had killed his brothers. That meant also that there was a legal obligation on his part to track them down and kill them. And we'll look at this in just a minute. He had a legal obligation under the law to avenge the blood of his brothers. So his marching across Jordan and everything that he did wasn't just at the behest of God, it was also to fulfill his obligations to the law. What are our obligations to the law of God? Should we get tired? Should we stop chasing? Should we ever give up in our chasing evil, in our chasing souls, in our chasing after the enemy? When do we quit? At what point do we say, I'm too tired? At what point do we say they've gone too far into that territory? He said, Jesus said, go ye into all the world. Command. Make disciples. Command. That means chase down the evil ones, destroy evil, and make them righteous. Paraphrasing. Now, we don't go out and kill them, but if we get them saved, have we not killed the old man? Paul said, you kill the old man. You do away with the old man. That's doing battle. That's killing the old man. That's killing the evil so that the good can rise to the top and we can get them saved. So Gideon says, if you hadn't have killed them, I wouldn't kill you. There was kind of an unwritten law that like in this case, what they would do is they would have taken them and made them servants, or, put them in servitude. And they would pay taxes to Israel, and Israel could have gotten rich. Gideon could have been rich off of all of the taxes and stuff he could charge these guys. They said, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to kill you. Verse 20. And he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. The nearest of kin was the blood avenger. But a magistrate might order anyone to do the work of the executioner. And the person selected was always of a rank equal or proportion to that of the party deemed to suffer. And the reference on that is 1 Kings 2:29. Gideon intended then, by the order to Jether, to put an honor on his son by employing him to slay 2 enemies of his country, and on the youth declining, he performed the bloody deed himself. You see, it was his responsibility, but he was the judge. He was the magistrate. And so he passed that responsibility on to his son, who was the eldest son. But the boy was just a youth. Now that probably, I don't know what that age is, but he may have just been a teenager. He was young enough that he wasn't trained in war. He was young enough that he was afraid. He may have even been younger than that. He was afraid. We sometimes, God asks us to do things and we're afraid. I know people that say, okay, we're going to go out and knock on doors, and people turn white. Oh, I can't do that. Okay, I'm going to hire you and I'm going to pay you $15 an hour to go out and knock on doors and hand out these leaflets for my company. Oh, no problem. What's the difference? See? We're afraid sometimes to do what God wants us to do or what we're asked to do, and we say, I'm just a youth. I'm not old enough. I don't know enough. I don't have enough education. I'm not versed enough in the scriptures. When I pray, I don't get the Spirit hit me and I dance in circles and shout. We have that in Pentecost. We think that praying has to be a shout or run around and fall on the floor. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm for those things. I think it's great. I would wish we get a lot more of that here. I'd like to see the power come down like it used to do and shake the place up good. And that's what we need. But prayer is not that alone. It happens at times, but that's not prayer. If somebody needs you to pray for them, I'm transparent, I guess, as pastor says. I used to be terrified to go up and pray for people at the altar. I don't know what to say. If I don't say anything, it makes sense. What am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? It was terrible. I'm pastoring and I'm having this thing about, it's kind of like there's a program on PBS, Doc Martin, I don't know if you're, it's one of these British comedy. We're into the British stuff, it's things we watch anyway. And this is a country doctor in this beautiful little town and small place. And every time he sees blood, he gets sick or passes out. And he's a doctor. It's absolutely hilarious sometimes, some of the stuff that happens. But anyway, but that's kind of the way we are, I mean that's the way I was. I should be able to do this easy. And it wasn't until I came to the realization that I don't have to get on there and shake them and shake them. No, I just have to speak to what the problem is. Makes praying easy. You know? And I've been able to pray all over, basically in the United States. Every time we go in our colors someplace, it seems like somebody wants prayer. Okay, come on over here, we'll pray. You know, it doesn't take a big thing. Just do it. And this boy, he was afraid to do it because he was a youth. God has things for us to do. Don't be afraid to do it. But when we are weak, then we are strong. All right. So the boy refused to do it. Verse 21. So Ziba and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and kill us. For as a man is, so is his strength." So Gideon arose and killed Ziba and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Now this statement by Ziba and Zalmunna is kind of interesting. First of all, I say, rise it up and kill us yourself. You do it. Don't give it to this boy. You do it. And there was a couple of reasons why. Number one, Gideon was stronger. Gideon was a man. And when he killed him, it would have been a complete kill. Where the boy may have had to stick him 3 or 4 times, and that would have been agony. So it was a faster death if Gideon did it. Also, it was an honor to die at the hands of a mighty man. It was a dishonor and a disgrace to die at the hands of a youth. So perhaps part of Gideon's reasoning in having the boy do it was to disgrace them by having a boy kill a king. But he wouldn't do it. So, and we're not told how he did it, but maybe Gideon just pulled out a sword and took her head off. Who knows? Yeah, that was the end of it. Now Gideon killed both of them, and he took the crescent ornaments that were around their camels' necks. Now, the custom of those days, among these Midianites and the other Arabs on the east side of the Jordan River, was that they would adorn their camels with these chains and crescent-shaped, crescent moon ornaments, usually made out of gold. And they would drape these over their camels. And when the camels moved, this chain would make noise. It wasn't a bell, you know, like a cattle bell, but it would make noise. And that crescent moon was in honor. They're supposed, they're not sure, but the assumption is that it was to honor Astarte, the moon goddess of the Phoenicians, from whom these borrowed that idolatry or that idol. In other words, the Phoenicians had this goddess Astarte, and was her symbol. And so they took this symbol, and they took the idol, and they took the worship, because they were nomads. They went up through Phoenicia, they were there, and they probably thought, hey, this is really cool. They had all these idols, perhaps, of Astarte, and I'm sure she was quite beautiful as the, you know, the statues and stuff, and said, well, this would be cool. Let's make her our idol, and we can have this pretty, you know, thing along with us. And so what Gideon did is he took all of these crescents and the chains, all the ornaments, and they took them off of them. Now, this custom of adorning the necks of their camels with gold chains and ornaments prevailed among the Arabs so late as the time of Muhammad. So it went on for literally hundreds of years with this custom. All right. Now let's look at Gideon's ephod. Verses 22 to 28. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you delivered us from the hand of Midian. What they were saying is, hey, we want to set up a monarchy here in Israel. Notice it didn't say the men from Manasseh or the men from Ephraim. It was Israel. These were the tribal leaders of Israel. And they came to him and said, we want to set up a monarchy. We want you to be the first king. And then it'll pass to your son and to the grandson. Just like all the other nations around us do. That sound familiar? We'll see this very same thing in a few hundred years with Solomon. With Samuel, prophet, and the setting up of Saul. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Now, Gideon did not say that he wouldn't be the judge. He didn't say that he would not take care of godly matters that came up. But he said, I am not going to be your earthly ruler. I am not going to be your king. In other words, you're not going to worship me. You're not going to treat me as somebody really special with the purple robes and all of this kind of stuff. Because that's reserved for He is your ruler. What? Here's a chance of a lifetime. Be a king. You get to be a real king. No, I don't want it. God is the only king. We need to keep that in our own lives. Making sure we don't set anything up as a king in our life or royalty in our lives except God. Verse 24. Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you. Notice this is not a demand. He's the head of the army right now. He's the commander-in-chief. But he does not make a command. He asks, makes a request, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites and Midianites are interchangeable. So what we learn of them, these particular people, is that the ancient Arabians were gorgeously adorned with barbaric pearl and gold. An immense amount of such valuable booty had fallen into the hands of the Israelitish soldiers. The contribution was liberally made, and the quantity of gold given to him equaled about 70 pounds in today's measure. So what Gideon said, asked for, was a single earring. The actual Hebrew that's used here, it means a single one ring from each guy. And these may have actually been nose rings rather than earrings. Because that was very prevalent in those days. These kids run around today with this stuff looking like they got snot running out of their nose. I don't get it. To me, I don't get it. What that's supposed to do. But in the ancient days, they actually put these gold rings, like they do in a bull. They would have gold rings. And that was supposed to be the adornment of the day. So these kids running around with piercings and all of that stuff, hey, you're about 4,000 years late with that one. Anyway, so they did. They brought these earrings. And so verse 25, so they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were around their camels' necks. So we learn here that they brought these rings, they put them down. They had about 70 pounds of these earrings or nose rings, whichever they were. Now the value of that on today's market, literally, I looked it up this afternoon, would have been about $1,487,360. That's just on the earrings. All right? So this was quite a contribution to Gideon. I was kind of laughing because I was looking at a commentary which was probably written around 1800s, and it said, well, the value today would have been $25,000. Yeah, right, okay, I'm not going to use that one. In addition to the earrings, Gideon also got everything that belonged to the two kings. So the crescent, gold chains and all of that were on the camels, all of their precious garments, the purples, the golds, the crowns, all of that stuff. He got that also. So you're looking here, I mean, Gideon probably walked out of there $2.5 million worth of stuff in today's market, you know. Mm-hmm. So I mean, this was a pretty successful operation here for him. All right. So what did Gideon do next? Verse 27. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. First time you read through this, you say, what in the world was he thinking about? Mm-hmm. I mean, here was Gideon, and we see Gideon, and he's down in the wine press. That's Gideon. Threshing in the wine press. And along came the angel of the Lord, whom Gideon recognized, and the angel of the Lord tells him what to do. The angel of the Lord gives him all of these directions. And after it's all over with, suddenly he gets all of this money, and what does he do? He runs out and has them build an ephod.
What is that?
Well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Oh.
The first thought that came to my mind, first time I read, I looked, I said, wait a minute. The ephod was a linen garment that was made for the high priest.
Oh, that's right.
Now, when Moses had that ephod made for Aaron, it says they took gold and silver and precious metals, and they made thread out of it, and they wove it into the linen garment so that it had beautiful designs all over, and it was a bib. Covered the back and the front, and it came over the top. It didn't have sleeves. It hung flat down the front, on the front and the back. And then over this ephod went the breastplate, which was about a hand's breadth this way. So it was about this big, this little breastplate. And on it was a stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Also in the breastplate was a pocket for the Urim and Thummim. It went in there. Now that was the high priest's garment. So whenever Moses or any ruler had a question that they wanted to ask God, they would go to the high priest. He would take the Urim and Thummim, and he would, nobody knows exactly how it was done. At least maybe, I don't know, some rabbis may know, but as far as I know, there's no written history of exactly how it was done. Whether they reached into the bag and the Urim meant no and the Thummim meant yes, or they rolled it out like dice, and however it came up it meant something, we don't know. But apparently it was probably lots, like drawing lots. Ask God a question, should I go to battle or not? They'd pull out the Urim or the Thummim, whichever one came out. That was the answer from God. Now this wasn't some superstition. This is what God set up. This was His plan. Why did He do that? I don't know. It seems to me God would have done something much better. Maybe a hologram would pop up in the middle of this thing, and God would stand there and say, well, this is what I want you to do. But why that? I don't know. But by the time Gideon had come along, the ark was sitting in Shiloh. The tabernacle was in Shiloh. So the high priest, if there was one in this period of time, was in Shiloh, which was part of the tribe of Ephraim. Our good old, full of pride and conceit, Ephraim. So it's quite possible that, number one, nobody wanted to go to Ephraim, and they certainly didn't want to go to Shiloh and have to go through Ephraim territory. I mean, there was this kind of bad feeling going on. Also, we learned that the ephod was, at this point anyway, was starting not just to be worn by the high priest. The ephod was made out of fine linen, and I told you about that. By the time of David, other priests, and even himself, wore one when inquiring of God. It was woven with gold and was very costly. You'll remember when David was bringing the ark back, it says he took off his ephod. So he had an ephod on when he was dancing before the ark as they carried it back to Jerusalem. So it became common for them to use the ephod. Now in Gideon's case, and again, this is all conjecture because nobody sat down with him and wrote a biography and said, now we want to know exactly why you did this. But it becomes apparent that he had it in his own town. He had this ephod made, and probably along with it the breastplate, which carried the Urim and Thummim in it. So when he, and this is conjecture, when he returned home and he needed to have God answer a question that he was judging, he would call in the priest who would put this on and draw out the Urim or Thummim, and that would be the answer. Now you see, it starts to make a little sense. As a judge of Israel, it would be normal for Gideon to seek the will of God through the Urim and Thummim. So having them close to him made sense. He could have the priest put on the ephod, the breastplate, and inquire of the will of God. Now the one problem that bothers me is, why did he not have faith in the angel of the Lord to come and give him the answer? This is my opinion. I think that Gideon felt that the angel of the Lord would only show up for monumental events. I think 135 Mennonite soldiers in the valley of Jezreel, that's a monumental event. Showing up to Abraham to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and all the towns of the plain, their cities of the plain, that was a monumentous event. So in Gideon's day, the feeling was you would not hear from the angel of the Lord unless it was something really big. And so when somebody came to you with a border dispute between two tribes and said, what do? You can't expect the angel of the Lord to come because it's not a big enough problem. See where I'm going? And so Gideon made a substitution. Now God never chastised Gideon for this. And by the way, it says it was a, how did the word say it? It became a snare to Gideon and his house. It wasn't to Gideon himself, because it never, we don't see where it ever affected him or his immediate family. But after he died, it became a snare, because we'll see what they did with it. And that's what happens when we try to get a hold of the head of God. We don't think God's capable of answering our questions because they're too small. No, let God be God. It appears that though Gideon had a godly purpose for making the ephod, it ended up to be a source of idolatry, much probably after his death. It's very possible that the people may have used it in conjunction with an idol to seek direction. because after Gideon died, we're going to find they went back to Baal. So it would not be, I don't think out of reason, think that they would have an idol of Baal sitting there and use the ephod to see what Baal had to say. Because Baal couldn't talk. You know, Baal never did anything. So, hey, now we got a way, we can ask Baal for the right answer, and he can give us the right answer. Which amounted to 50-50 chance. All right. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So for 40 years, they were quiet, they were at peace, the Midians never came back. Verses 29 to 35. Then Jerubbaal the son of Joash, that's Gideon, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons, who were his own offspring. He had many wives. Now this guy had a problem. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. And we're going to find out about this guy later on. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abizarites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal Berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, or Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. The way to think about it, Gideon had 70 sons. I wonder how many daughters he had. No wonder he had all that money. He needed it.
Many wives.
Wow. Wow. Now this concubine lived in Shechem. In those days you could have concubine. And I guess that was what you would call a legal prostitute. I don't know how else you put that. So he had his own, and that was in Shechem. And he had this son by the name of Abimelech. And we will find out later about Abimelech and what he did, but he became a very ruthless ruler in Manasseh. All right, 40 years. It took 40 years for Gideon to die. It took 40 years for Israel to completely forget the miracle in the valley of Jezreel. And how often do we forget the miracles God does for us?
Yeah.
Really? You know, we say, oh, God has done so much for me. Okay, write it down on a piece of paper. Well, let's see, last week, and I don't remember the week before that, and last year, I don't, man, that's ancient history. We forget what God has done. We forget the miracles He does for us. We forget things. And, you know, God told Israel when He brought them out of Egypt, when they crossed the Jordan River, He said, you put up these, actually when they crossed the Dead Sea, Red Sea, dead red, whatever. He had them put up stones, monuments. He said, lest they forget what I have done for you.
Yeah.
And we need to have monuments.
Yeah.
We need to let ourselves, our children, and rehearse it. God said rehearse it 3 times a day. Let them know what I did bringing you out of Egypt. And so I think we need to do that, and we're amiss if we don't. Any questions?
I'm just kind of curious, if he had 70 sons, how many daughters did he have?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't say.
Whoa.